afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon in Kino Armata. My name is Nastazja Domaradzka. I am a Polish theatre director based and working in London, and I'll be moderating and chairing this, what I hope is going to be a very invigorating discussion with Julia Wissert, who is sitting next to me here, who is the artistic director of theatre in Dortmund. And we're joined online on the screen behind me by artistic director of Antigent, Milo and author and writer Strauss. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be talking about representation, play, and what I personally like to call artistic responsibility in this ever-changing, challenging world. And I'd like to start with a simple question to the panelists, starting from Julia next to me. What is change?
A simple question, and we start with the question of what is change in theatre? Or in theatre?
In theatre, what is change? In art, in theatre, what do we understand as change?
I think art has changed. Like this, I feel in my practice as a director as well as an artistic director that the only constant is that continuously things are adapting to new environments and new settings, and we have to create art, which then creates a response or resonance, which then is being feedbacked into the institution and into the practice, and then this is being incorporated in this process of changing. So maybe change is becoming the artist that in 150 years I always wanted to be.
Great. Moving on, could I hear from Milo, please?
Yeah, I mean, I can underline what Julia said. I think what is changing, even in a career of perhaps 15 years I have as a director and now also as an artistic director, you can clearly see the different generations of people, and you can even feel yourself becoming a generation during this kind of time going by, yourself adapting, especially as an artistic director, to then different generations, different, of course, also regions or traditions of making. And when you bring them together and you are confronted to a public that is also changing, so then you start to feel, when we are talking about the topic of representation, how this is changing at the very moment quite fast. When I remember when I started 15 years ago, it was, I mean, for example, the independent scene and the let's say the state theatre scene was quite divided, and now I have the impression, for example, this came together, and so this is one big change I lived in my lifetime.
Thank you so much. And Simon?
Well, maybe just adding, not from the personal or artistic view, but more general theatre and change. I mean, Milo just said, or used the word tradition. I would say change is the opposite word to tradition, no? And the question with change is always, how do we justify change? And how do we say that this was old school and this is new school? And so for me, change in theater has a lot to do with artistic arguments we find to justify change.
Thank you so much. Those are great answers. I'm asking this question not without a reason. I think everything that we're going to talk about for the next hour or so is connected to change, whether it's political change, whether it's the change of art form, and I think starting with our understanding what change is, as well as Milo, you wrote in Antigent manifesto that it is no longer about representing the world, it's about changing it. And I was wondering, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think it's also a bit personal way of when I made the decision to become the artistic director of an institution, I was asking myself, but because I was not born to be an artistic director, and I perhaps in 3 years, because I made a kind of a limit to me to then hand over the institution to somebody else. So what should be changed institutionally, and how should this institution? It's a state-based national theatre in Flanders, the Ghent theatre. So what should change there that this stage becomes able to represent as much as possible reality outside the institution, how the institution somehow can adapt. And then we develop this manifesto. And when we are talking about change and being overruled yourself by change, is that now we readapt again. For example, there is no point about sustainability in it. Even there are some points a bit by accident, but this was not the topic. And then you change the perspective, and then you have to adapt what means to adapt yourself to reality. But I think that's the main interest in my specific work, to ask myself, but how can the art system and society come together to create what we call kind of microeconomics, like parallel societies, ways of perhaps living inside the system, but in another way, or connecting to cultural structures that are not in the system already. So that you go to play in places or collaborate in places that were not foreseen, or with people that are not foreseen to be on the stage of a state theater. And this is an ongoing process.
Thank you so much. And Julia, on that note, I would like to ask you about, similarly to Milo, I guess, becoming someone who leads an institution, and how that your views on change in terms of representation of the society the institution is supposed to represent, how is that implementing that thinking into becoming part of the institution, I guess?
I would say it's what Strauss said about how to justify change. It's the question of legitimization of the organization. If no one is coming into a theater, I think it's not a problem of uncultured others who are outside of an institution, but rather it's a question of you have to reflect on your own practice and what you are doing and what you're representing and what you're also putting out into the world. Because if you produce the best thing, the hottest shit, so to say, people will come. However, I think that, especially in Germany, there was this time when it was a clear us and them, and this situation was manifested over decades, and now everyone wants them to come into the institution, but just wanting people to come in isn't enough anymore. It's a question of what Milo said, creating microecologies maybe even, which is a more sustainable way of producing and creating for the space that you are based in, which is really important to us. And also this question of creating networks and what is left behind after the production is gone. What is the network that can continue to grow, and how can people who are part of maybe a small production then continue something which might be something completely different, and then the organization becomes a platform and transforms from simply being a theater. I think that's also something that Entigen tries to a platform and a space for exchange, a space for conversation, or a cafe.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much. And Simone, on the back of what Julia just said, in terms of theatre becoming a platform, for someone who writes, how do those blank pages become a platform, and how does that manifest itself in terms of a very changing society in Germany, the sort of post-migrant society?
Well, first and foremost, I would underline that we have a very exclusive and special situation in Germany. There's no country where in the world who has so many theaters, not only state theaters, but just buildings, theaters. In every bigger city, we have these houses, these buildings. And so that's a huge legacy, a huge tradition, but also a lot of pressure, I would say, on theater makers and the society in itself, because what do we do with these places, basically, And I mean, I think we are kind of agreeing on the question of change. There has been a rapid change just in the last 20 years about, you know, who is coming to the theater, what generations are coming to the theater, us and them, as Julia just said. This is really rapidly changing now. Even in my circle of friends, you know, in Berlin, beginning of 30 years old people, they just don't go to the theater anymore. You know, they have art galleries and Netflix instead. So first and foremost, there's a huge tradition break, I would say. But the houses, the institutions haven't really reacted to this so far. I mean, obviously there are trials like the two people who are here today, Julia and Milo, who have done certain things differently. But in general, I would say in Germany, there's still the open question, what do we do with the houses? And the second point would be the production costs, yes, but also the number of productions in itself. We have, after Corona, you know, people said everything will change and people will start to reflect about what, you know, the theater could be and stuff like this. But the opposite is the case. It's more than how we used to be before, in my opinion, you know. We produce more. We have more shows going on. We have more, you know, costs and more material which we use for 10 productions, and then, you know, it's over. So we really have to ask ourselves, what do we want, at least in Germany, what do we want with these institutions, and very practical questions about the houses and the material they use.
Thank you. And I know, Julia, you were dying to say something.
Yeah, because I think it's an interesting point. I mean, there are colleagues sitting from all over the world here, and to go into the specifics of the German system, I think is something that we three can do, but might not be as relevant, so I'm not going to say as something to that. But what I think is interesting, what you just said, is this break of tradition. And I think this break of tradition and the question of the future of theatre is linked to the question of how society changed and the question of representation. Because it's not just a moment of younger people not wanting to come in the space, is my experience, but rather when you said tradition, the houses have traditions, I thought, but your tradition is my worst nightmare, because the tradition of the house or the houses in Germany, and I'd say theatres all over the world in general, are very homogeneous, let's say, in the narratives that they put out. And the thing that we're faced with right now, in my opinion, is that the opening or the loudness of different positions within society, the loudness for representation, something that Netflix is making tons of money with, and they're probably not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, but simply for making tons of money, is something that has consequences for the theatre as well. And I think this is where one of the most important questions is sitting that we have to answer. Who is creating? Who controls the resources? Who is allowing who to tell what? And what does that mean, without going into an essentialist discussion about you can only do ... But I think it's an interesting conversation that might be a conversation that we're having all over the world, this question of power, responsibility and representation.
I'm very happy with the fact that I think all of us at some point mentioned the word relevance and what is relevant, and also on the back of what you just said, Julia, we are here surrounded by an international colleagues, international audience. We are in Pristina, Kosovo. We are in a building that holds a lot of political memory, and I think our stories individually are all different, and they all, you know, almost shaped by our histories, the countries we come from, our backgrounds. And I really want to talk about relevance in terms of, you know, story and who tells the story. Now I'm a Polish theatre maker that lives in Britain, and usually when people ask me what I do, I answer with I make feminist work. And depending on where I am in the world, this gets different responses. Britain, for example, is, you know, has begun conversations about representations that my home country, Poland, hasn't yet, and that in one example, that is a conversation about gender and representation of women on stage and representation of women backstage. I know that in Germany and Switzerland and Belgium, there's this this phrase now, post-migrant theatre, yes, that is being used quite often to acknowledge the fact that the society we live in have changed. And I guess where I'm going with this is, do we change who tells the stories? And if so, how do we do it? And how do we do it in an ethical way? Julia, I'll start with you.
I think you're not obliged to change anything. I didn't become an artistic director because I thought I wanted to break something, or I wanna offend people, but rather the circle of artists that I was surrounded by and the narratives that I was curious about were somehow different from the dominant narratives in most theaters in Germany. And I wouldn't say every theater, but most. And what we in Dortmund try to create is to become a space that, as Milo also said, is creating microecologies and figuring out how to create a production practice that acknowledges first and foremost there's an aesthetic search, and it's not social work, and it's not activism either, but it's an artistic practice which is very much trying to hack reality and create networks and collaborations which might otherwise not have come into existence, I'd say. And within doing that, we also ask the question of what are we actually putting on stage in terms of what narratives are we giving space, because it's a resonance space. So for example, if we were to put, as a crass example, I'd say if we were to put a rape on stage, that would resonate and something would happen, and we have a responsibility to think about what are we trying to do with it and why does it have to be, because at the end of the day we are creating art. So the question is, how do we translate this moment of violence into an aesthetic moment without raping someone on stage, because it's theater, it's not reality, and it's a hyper-coded space that works through decoding and encoding. And I'm being very vague, but I hope you can follow, because I want to avoid going into certain discussions, because I feel it's something, in order for people to be interested and curious about an artistic practice, I think you have to feel that there's urgency in the narratives without actually, or maybe reproducing an experience someone in the audience might have had. And that is something where I think we're too homogeneous also in thinking about audiences. Who are we imagining when we are thinking about our audiences, and who is everyone? And who are we trying to reach with our work? Maybe that's something that is a Knotenpunkt and not in our work at the moment in Dortmund. And I'd be curious to hear how it works in Ghent, and what you think, Simon, as a critic.
If you agree, Simon, I start. I want to come back on, just before I go to the question of microecologies and also representation or repetition of power structures on stage. I think for me, one of the first questions is really who produces, who plays, who is represented, and what stories are told on a very basic level. And I think there, when you ask about Ghent, Julia, then the situation in Flanders is super different from France and from Germany and from Italy, because what we call the canon doesn't really exist in Flanders. They say you can read the whole Flemish canon in one afternoon, because there are actually 3 plays that are existing. So the practice that you would completely reappropriate the space of theater to tell your stories has, I think, another tradition, or it's a bit why you would do theater, or the status of directors is much lower than for example the idea of the company of actors and actresses that are producing their own plays without the director. So this is a perhaps a tradition that is more simple to realize what I wanted to realize, and that's one reason. And I'm very impressed by you, Julia, doing it in Germany. It's much more simple in Belgium, I think, or in Flanders especially, to kind of open this space to another politic and to a kind of a reappropriation of this bourgeois space of the 19th century. For me, the most important thing is microecologies, and then I will come very shortly on the idea of the representation. But for me, every project has to change, or I would say we don't make theater plays or production to tell stories. It's important, but to change every time how actually you produce. So the production process is changed by producing, and the product is important, but not the end aim. So, for example, we started doing films during the COVID times, and when we said, okay, now we will distribute the film. Of course, you can then go, in that time when cinemas were closed, you can go to Netflix, you can go to Amazon, but we decided to open a new distribution system with 150 closed cinemas, and we created a new platform to then distribute this together. So for me, also the question, how do we distribute? Another example is we opened this film school in Mosul. So we started 2016 to go there, 2018, 19, we made a play, and then we came together with UNESCO to say, okay, and now we try to together with the Arts Academy, to create an institute there that will produce completely independently from us, and then these plays or these films can then travel to us and be exchanged. So I think that's the reason of collaborating, to have then independent. I even love more the idea of microecology than microeconomics. I'm a Marxist, so I was a bit too much based on economics, but it's true. But in the end of the day, of course, it's the question, do they have access to the distribution system? And that's why it's very important that you also think in this, when you give the stage to, for example, a company, that then you make them known to other theaters that later, for example, they can tour or they can play and produce somewhere else. And that all this is part of a system, how you try to support somebody. To now come to the question of the representation, I think it's in my humble opinion, it's the most difficult one. It's really the most difficult one because, for example, I had a discussion when we made, that's another personal story, when we made the Jesus film, and there's a very long and you would say racist torture scene, because our Jesus was Yvon Sagnier, a black activist. And there's a very long torture scene. And we discussed about it, and I explained that the necessity, besides the fact that it is a Jesus film and there is the crucifixion and the torture, there is structural violence that is completely invisible on the fields in South Italy, where we filmed the film, and becomes visible in this kind of representation of it in a metaphoric space. And then, of course, the question is, how is the people working in this metaphoric space together, how the idea of the scene is born, and how is the context of this scene, because it's also about context. I think often when we talk about trigger, etc., we imagine that there's just a story and at one moment something pops up that is completely traumatizing. That's absolutely possible, but I think it's very important to build the context and the story where then the representation of violence, for example, becomes possible.
Yes, I'm just going to quickly jump to Julia and then we'll go to Simone. Thank you so much, Milo.
Milo, can I ask you, but really with the utmost love for your work and what you're doing, in the moment that you're, and really because I never get a chance to speak with you, and I'm using this time in Pristina to actually ask you, in the moment that you're creating this violent scene, are you imagining me to watch this film and to see this scene and thinking, but why are you reproducing this? I experience this every day, or other people, and I'm not even dark-skinned black. I know other dark-skinned black people in Germany who are experiencing this, and how do you think about the moment the audience isn't white? And how do you speak about this in the team? Because that's something that we're speaking a lot about. because as a director, I completely understand how to put a scene like that into the film, yet at the same time, I know exactly my colleagues behind me who would be, but what does that mean if I watch the film, and how to contextualize, as you said, for, and hopefully also dark-skinned black audience, because the film had a reason for being produced. It was supposed to make something visible.
Yeah, I mean, very practically, of course, it's made by panels, by invitations of people watching, of course, the film before and after. And as an example, when we showed it in 12 or 13 cities in the US last summer, we did this together with Black Lives Matter, and a lot of groups that then would watch the film first and give kind of the admission to show it in their city, and then would do a panel and talk about it, where there is critique in it, but there is also a kind of a trying to understand what is the South Italian situation, where this was born and produced by all these NGOs and actors and so on. But you are absolutely right, and this is a kind of it's a kind of a circle question to say, because in every scene you would do. And sometimes I'm really, I saw now in Zurich some place, for example, where I was shocked and other people not at all. And I said, aha, okay. And I think the only solution when we talk now about, for example, the traumatized memories and experience and look on this kind of images from people of color, for example, the only solution is to very closely in the production process work together with this possible public, you know. I think that's the only thing, but you are never sure, because you can't contextualize in a way that I think it's a kind of a very difficult problem. That's absolutely true.
Would you like to?
Okay. On the back of that, I'm just wondering, Simon, coming from all of this to the point of view of a critic and seeing the work perhaps change in Germany, is there a conversation or a space to sometimes acknowledge that the work that is being made needs a bigger perspective in terms of who is reviewing it?
Who's reviewing it, not who's watching it, but who's reviewing it, you're saying. So now we're talking about structures in the media?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the debate. I can just talk about it in Germany, not as big as on the representation side on the stage, I would say, but still, obviously it's a question about the female and male perspective, and then also about all the different other identity questions. But maybe I shouldn't go into much further in this, because I found it very interesting. I wanted to add something about the discussion before, and I want to underline that I'm kind of seeing it as Milo, that this is really the hardest thing to talk about representation in a 1-hour panel, you know, because first and foremost one has to ask, you know, what is the small gap between imposition, so Zumutung, imposition of a play, and then trauma, causing a trauma of a play. You know, that would be my first big question. You know, how do you artistically, or as Julia said, I mean, or I would ask you, Julia, about this. I mean, how do you really differentiate between these things? Because I'm sure you would also agree that art sometimes needs to be provocative, needs to, you know, make something visible, which you know, attacks also people in the audience. I mean, I at least would wish that as a viewer. But then, so this was my first question, basically. How do you, you know, elaborate on the small gap between imposition and trauma? And then on a personal note about, you know, who is reviewing. I mean, for me, and that's very personal, I never really thought about this question even until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. As a theater critic, because I was always, you know, talking about the stories, or thinking about, you know, putting myself into the shoes of the people I see on the stage. You know, I put myself into the shoes of a of a woman, for example. You know, I feel with the woman, or I feel with an immigrant, or I feel with the king. You know, so I, and Julia would probably say, as a male privileged white background, you know, didn't really reflect on this question. But then I was in New York in the Broadway, and I had was very lucky to see Hamilton. I'm sure you all know this big success Broadway musical where not all black but diverse cast is kind of representing the U.S. history, the glorious U.S. history. And next to me, I was surrounded by a school class by nearly all black young teenagers, and the way they were reacting on this, and the way they were, you know, feeling that this is their story, made me think about the question of representation. So I just wanted to share this moment of experience, basically.
Thank you, and I think this is great because we organically moved towards what I really want to talk about, the subject of representation, and how we make art, and how we make art ethically, understanding, for the lack of better word, that sometimes we cannot solely tell the stories that we want to tell. Milo is talking about, you know, ownership and working closely with people whose stories, you know, the theater he makes collaboratively belong to. Who is it for? I think is such an important question that is connected to representation. And is it, and you already mentioned audiences and changing audiences, understanding that, you know, for example, in Britain, where I live, there's a huge problem with aging audiences that come from a certain background. There's a huge need for attracting young people to return to the theater. And I'm glad you mentioned Hamilton, Simon, because I actually was going to mention it in terms of representation. Yes, this is a piece that you know, is performed by black actors, black performers. It was written, and the idea of it was created by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is of Latin origin, yet the rest of the whole creative team is white. And it is a sort of, you know, an example, I guess, of maybe it's not just who we put on stage, but as Milo referred earlier to, who has the power of distribution, and who is in charge of programming, and who is in charge of making decisions. Julia, would you like to elaborate on these points?
Yeah, definitely. And Simon, it's just to give an answer to what you asked. To me, what did you say? Offense and trauma, I think were the words you used. If I'm right? Imposition, sorry. Yeah. Imposition and trauma were the words that you used. And I think that's really interesting, because my feeling is that my trying to impose things on people is being read as qualitatively less interesting art. It's not being read. And it's because on Saturday I had a premiere with a piece that was very important to me by Annie Arnaud. A little ad break for everyone. And the interesting thing was that in the critiques, there was nothing about class. There was nothing about the bodies on stage, but rather the question of, am I like Johann Simons or am I different? And to me, that's really interesting, because another question that comes with this idea of changing narratives and changing bodies on stage is, what happens then with the critics? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones who have to decode this moment of imposition or trauma, and maybe as soon as it changes from imposition and trauma to making visible or putting on stage, giving space, it becomes unreadable in certain contexts, and we have this argument or this discussion about the quality of art, which is very quickly being used by critics. Sorry, I keep saying it wrong. And to me, that's something where I think maybe I'm wrong, but not many people have the privilege of traumatizing and imposing. And it's a privilege for certain artists, and I think I'm happy that they do it, But I think the question of who tells what story and what happens on stage is more complex than just about imposition and trauma. Or maybe I would add another dimension. I would say visibility and power, maybe. And then we come into the space of unreadability, because with Hamilton, we also have these stories in Germany. We also have mixed race people in German history which are being completely wiped out of German history, and there's no one interested in doing a musical about a black librarian in Leipzig from the 17th century. Or these stories are not being brought up, and I think this is something that maybe is going to come and would be interesting, but the moment that I think we are at is this question of redistribution of power and influence and resources, and creating spaces for diverse perspectives. And maybe, and this I think is a challenging thing, because as you said, Milo, I really think it's interesting to think about the process as one of the main aspects of a production. So it's not only about what's going to come out in the end, but also about contextualizing, having conversations, and giving background to what you are doing. And at the same time, how much background can you give in order not to make visible what you maybe try to do in the shadows?
Yes, that makes absolute sense. And I think if we're talking about artistic responsibility, and I'm really intrigued by what Julia just said, and in terms of there's this myth that if we become aware of how we make, who we make with, if we become aware of our own shortcomings with our own identity, and we want to, expand how we make our art, that it makes less interesting art, when in fact it couldn't be more true. It could be less true, because it makes a more meaningful art.
It's a question of what is the radical, or what is radicality in a way, because I feel that if we spoke to Maud, who is here, I think these conversations are 50 years old, 100 years old, the ones that we are having right now. People have always been discussing whose body is in what space representing what, and why are some bodies neutral and universal, and other bodies always have to give disclaimers on why they're there. And so I think Hamilton is an interesting performance, and I didn't know the fact about the white creative team. And also, what's really important to me is I'm not really interested in whiteness as skin color, but as a power structure, as a way to have the privilege to enter certain spaces, and also as something that's a fluid identity. So if I'm here on the streets in Pristina, I might be black, but if Jeton came to Germany and started speaking German with an accent, he wouldn't pass as white anymore, because then people would see, he's not German. So this is what I mean by power and whiteness as a power structure.
Acceptable whiteness. Yes, and I think I would like to move to ask Milo this question about radicalism and taking the world has changed in the last couple of years, and wherever we sit in Kosovo, where we sit in London, where we sit in Dortmund or Belgium, our reality is no longer the same, whether it's the pandemic, the global crisis, the ever-changing climate crisis that is upon us. Things have shifted quite quickly, I would say. And I guess my question is, taking everything into account, what we've been talking about, and representation in terms of race, gender, class, abilities, how do we move beyond this being a question of representation, and how do we move towards this being a normality?
I think if we move now from representation to the question of the artistic team, because it was interesting that it was said, okay, Hamilton is there is the author and there is the cast, but the team is I guess also middle class white team, you know. So the question is, for me, the normalization of that artistic team is diverse, and I understand the work we do as a theater, and I try to do in my plays as normalization of diverse casts. Do you still hear me? Because you are freezed. You still hear me? Because okay. All is fine. Okay, sorry, it was a freeze on my. And just because we were talking today about opening play we did in Ente Ghent, I was inviting some non-professional actors. For example, one actress, a black actress who was not an actress at that moment, but just somebody who came to the casting, and then we started talking, and then she had a role in the play, and then in the second play she had a kind of, because it's also, my art is often not seen as real art, so then she had a real play with Luc Perceval, and the third one was directed by herself that she did. And she had her team. And I think that's this normalization, and perhaps every country is different. I have the impression that we have in Belgium, for example, a lot of theaters that have these kind of plays with a not only mixed team, but for example, Dalila Hermans, who made a play for us with exclusively black female activists. So and it was quite normal, and the hall was full. So I think it's a long process of normalizing it, and it might be radical and extreme when you have the first time, I don't know, only I don't know, a team that is only formed by topics, and also by a team that is of color, and then like 5 years later it becomes a kind of a genre or a part of the machine, like Johan Simons or Luc Perceval is one, and me, and so on, and Julia. So I think this is really a process, and I think everything is awareness, and that's why, I mean, these discussions, we have like, I would say 10 of those every day. And I think you all know it. It's kind of a way of it's kind of a sound that you have all the time since 5, 6, perhaps 10 or 15 years around. And I think what we have to do, that not bring, here we have the sound and the panels, and here we have the institutions, but really understand the institutions as the realization of these debates.
Great, thank you so much. Simone, would you like to maybe elaborate on that in terms of from a point of view of a critic?
I mean, I find it, first and foremost, I find it thrilling to imagine how theater will change when this claim of representation really is more and more becoming the driving force of the change. And I mean, I imagine that, you know, the question of identity and representation is per se endless in some ways. No, I mean, we can, once we climb one step, we can come to another and another and another. And I would like to think about this not only as a political question, you know, I mean, how diverse is the cast? Because then you obviously have to define diversity, and you have to say, okay, is what Jérôme Bell, for example, does, you know, working with disabled people in his shows, is that diverse enough, or do we need to have more diversity even in it? And I mean, I as a critic or viewer, I mean, obviously I don't judge about this question, but I could imagine that this will be in the future more and more a debate. You know, what is diversity? Define diversity. And then the second point I would like to make is, for me, and I put this.
Oh, I think a technical glitch there.
Stories in the end. So I think that
we lost you there for a second. Do you mind repeating what you've been saying for the last 10 seconds? We lost you.
Okay, sorry. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I was talking about Jérôme Bell, but then I was talking about the question of the stories on stage. So the Black Librarian in Leipzig, I think Julia was mentioning, no? Which no one is interested in. So for me, ethic critique or as a writer or whatever, diversity is also a criterion for the canon. So not only let Macbeth be played by an all-black cast or by a woman or by disabled people, but also what are the new stories from the past or from the present which this diverse wave or wave of diversity is bringing to us. And I'm very thrilled about this fact. And I think this hasn't really, at least in Germany, that hasn't really been at the center of attention, because obviously theater makers are always fearing that then people don't come if they don't know the author. Oh, it's not Shakespeare, so the school classes won't come, you know?
Yes, and what you're getting at now is, of course, the
subject of risk, and the word risk, you know, is always thrown at people who do not fit a certain box. People who have historically not been seen as people who make theatre, or people who have historically been, you know, not allowed spaces. And again, taking the context of where we are, maybe in Kosovo, this conversation is going to be about women on stage and, you know, how women are represented. In Britain, this conversation about women on stage has started 5-6 years ago. We're somewhere else now in terms of how we talk about race and class. I'm sure it's similar in Germany. So again, depending on the little you know, worlds and societies that we live in, there is a need for change. It just depends on the context and where we are. I think there's something about, yes, please.
I would like to ask the question if it's really right to think about these things one after the other, because we had a conversation earlier where Yeton also said the conversation is at a certain point, and now that you did this counting, I thought, but isn't it literally the problem is it's not one after the other, but it's a matrix of things that are rolling towards us and we have to deal with them, and at the same time they are linked. It's an intersectional question. It's not do this and do that. And also what you said, Simon, or Herr Strauss, is, to me, it's a question of if 10 theatres in Germany did that, it wouldn't be a question if Jérôme Bell has a diverse cast, because then you could go to, I don't know, Maxim Gorki Theatre, and you could go to Schauspiel Hannover to see something differently, and you go to Munich to see something differently, because they're different theatres with different expertises, and not one space has to cover everything. Because I think that's one of the challenges also, that we all think we have to do everything, and this is not going to give, I don't think that's possible, and also I don't think any one person should have the burden of everything at once to solve it within 2 years or 3 years or 1 production or 5 productions, but rather I think the potential is that European-wide we have to connect with each other and invite each other's work, invite each other's position, to understand at the end of the day the question of visibility of women in Kosovo is a question for Germany as well. In Germany we ask the same questions: what is a woman, and do they wear dresses all the time, or do we have to think about performativity in a more complex, a more essentialist way at this point? But I think there are basics that connect us, and I think we have to be, the specifics might be local, regional and country, but I think it's important to have connections and to show each other's work and to give impulses into the societies and communities that we're working in, and to host these conversations in order to be influenced and connect with each other, and not have the responsibility of Milo transforming Flanders just by himself, and you doing work in London and Yeton doing work in Kosovo, and we struggle by ourselves, but rather how can we exchange, collaborate and create different perspectives and normalize what we all are already doing, and making it visible and making it more relevant in a mainstream that we're at the same time trying to dissolve, maybe.
No, I absolutely agree with you, and you know, it's we're gonna go to Milo now. It's quite frustrating that it happens as a count, because I think, you know, look around you. What surrounds me? Who am I surrounded by? How do I make work for that community? Over to you, Milo.
You know, I think I was just thinking when you made this enumeration of class, women, POC, etc., and when I look back to the last 20 years, this is for me the danger of having the fashionable minority in the, for example, of the 0 years, every director, Maxim Gorky Theater and wherever, had a choir of workless people because class was the big thing, you know. And then you had like all 2 or 3 years, you had the losers from the eastern part of Germany, and then the question of race and so on. And I'm really, I think it's very dangerous to kind of use the machine to represent it, but not to integrate it in the institution itself. So that's why the theater that Julia makes, I mean, we are now in the understatement, but Julia, but I think it's very important that you institutionalize it. And then like it was made in Maxim Gorky Theater, and that you say, okay, here is the place where we're in a kind of a, you could say even exclusively somehow, we say this is now the theater that does more this or does more that, etc. And this is institutionalized. And when you would go away, what one day happens, then it stays like this. I mean, it becomes different, but it has a bit the same vision, and it just doesn't disappear, you know. So when the question was about this kind of shitstorm around about Charmaine Langhoff, everybody was saying, okay, that's a difficult moment, but if she goes away, then it will disappear. So we have to stay strong somehow. And I think this is for me super important, that we give this time to people, this time to institutions, that we really work on kind of landing these things and not changing every 3 years, because it's like what you said, Simon, when you put Shakespeare on it, etc. I remember when I made plays in the very beginning, and there was one sentence of Goethe in it, and they said, couldn't you write following Goethe or something like this, because nobody will see a Milo Rau play, of course. And then, but that the same becomes also for these kind of questions of representation of so-called minorities, that you don't have to change it all the time, because if not, you fall back in the Goethe trap.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something to be said about, and I just want to ask you that, Milo, you know, how has your perspective from going to a director that was starting out 5 years ago to, you know, someone who has now implemented this change into the work you're making, and quite, I would say, successfully, having studied your manifesto and seen a lot of your work. Could you maybe summarize how that has enriched your practice?
I think the most difficult thing for an artist becoming an artistic director, and I don't know if you have the same experience, Julia, is to not miss the moment when you have to step a bit back and to say, okay, that's why, for example, when I started the Intelligent, I said, okay, give me 5 years, and then the system has to be in a way that if I say I go, then nobody would even see that the bureau is empty. You know, that's I think the idea of changing the institution and not having cool people in an institution that stays the same somehow. I'm not saying that I'm cool, but you know what I mean. So it's trying to implement change, but this also means, and this is somehow hard, that you have from processes, from decisions, you have slowly to step away, what you say, because you come to a power position where you can kind of, you have a kind of an authority that people would say, okay, that's a good idea, let's do it. But then you have to step away from these other people who is doing then their ideas. I give you one example. We set the guest programming, we made it our own, and now we have, from next season on, we have 30% of guest program, but what we have the so-called city Turks who are doing it. So 30% is completely giving away, and so on and so on. So I think you have to, you have to find a transition moment, because I think the model we have in capitalism is just you start here, and then you try to go up, and when you go up, then you try not to fall. No, that's a bit the model we are educated in. and that this in the heads of people starts to change. When I listened to Simon saying after Corona it's even more the same like before Corona, it is like if we are hypnotized by this this kind of rule that the same has to multiplicate all the time.
Juliet, on the back of this, do you think there is a question here about the change of form? And it's not just, you know, because I often struggle with these conversations because they seem to be about cosmetic changes rather than institutional changes. And what Milo is referring to, and I think what Simone was referring to earlier on, is it's a structural thing. It's something that has to be embedded in how we work. To quote Audre Lorde, you cannot dismantle a master's house using the master's tools.
Everyone always uses that quote.
I love that quote. But how does the form, how is what we're talking about, how does that inform the form, I guess, is my question.
It's so interesting what you said, Milo, about the process of stepping away, because I feel that it's different if you're not part of a system with different Sparten. We have opera, philharmonics, acting, youth theatre, dance, and the Academy for Digitization and Theatre. And with these different aspects in one space, you have to be even more strategic in positioning certain people to fight the battles of resources whenever you have to fight battles for resources. And at the same time, you have to be, or yes, I think it's a question of form, and to change the form without people getting weary or seeing, like, being threatened by what is going to come, but rather inviting them in and showing them the potential of what the difference could be. That I find very challenging at the moment, because as Milo said, it's a system where people have contracts for 30 years. When I started, one colleague, a lovely colleague, came up to me and said, when you were born, I was already working here, and now you are my boss. That is a strange situation for me, and we're absolutely fine now, but she never went to another theatre or any other space or worked anywhere else. And then I came in and was like, okay, everything that happened before is okay, but now we're doing it completely differently in order to create a sustainable organization that is inviting to different arts practices in a long-term way. And everyone just looked at me and was like, no, no, because why and how, and it means more work, more dialogue, more conversations, more understanding, more moderation. What you said about the inviting different people into the space, from my experience, it means a lot of moderating and giving an understanding of why we're doing this and why we are currently building Stadtintendants, like city intendants, of 10 people to take my job. And to find out what it means if it wasn't me at the top, but rather 10 people from the city. And by the city we mean everyone, so it can also be people from the theatre. And what we're experiencing at the moment is this question of, I don't want the responsibility. I'm happy that there's someone at the top who is being held accountable in case something goes wrong. And to create an understanding of collegiality and collaboration that is different than an authoritarian system. I'm not sure if we'll succeed in the next 50 years, in Germany at least, to create this new understanding of an organization. But I completely agree what you said, and what we haven't spoken about is that I think we're all trying to question and to question what theatre is at the moment, and to show what it potentially could be in the present and the future. Like what you said about creating a film school, starting networks, doing, I don't know, we do writers' workshop, we connect people with authors, but it's not classical theatre, it's not the canon, and sometimes people just come and say, but this is not theatre what you're doing, and our understanding is that it is theatre because It's supposed to give impulses into the society that we're living in and creating alternative realities which might be more interesting for a few people and less interesting for other people. And this in an artistic space or outside or somewhere else. And to hack these borders and boundaries and say theatre can be anything that creates community, let's say, if we were to keep it very vague. So I think it's definitely about the form and it's definitely about the structure. But the structure, I'm slowly but steadily realizing, at least in Germany, they are, what Simon said, there are the pride and joy of a lot of people in German society that are not very amused about people coming in and saying, hey, you know what, I'm also part of German society, so I can also say what should be played and who should be on stage. And these 10 other people and artists can also say it because they also pay taxes or don't pay taxes, but they're still part of our society. So let's see what happens. And I think this is the tension field that we're currently in.
And that's very challenging. Thank you for that honest answer, Julia. And Simon, from a point of view of watching a lot of theatre, and how does that, is there something tangible about the change of form that you're witnessing as an audience member, as a critic?
Well, the awareness of the problem is obviously there, but I couldn't say that on the stage there has so much change, at least in the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years where I watch theater regularly. There is a lot of talk about the structures, and there's a lot about always returning the question of, do we need someone on the top, or should we come back to the collective idea? So I think it's a lot of talking. I mean, to be a little bit provocative, a lot of theater makers talk about it to get certain positions because they know that the political decision makers, because in the end it's the political decision makers who put someone like Julia or Milo in place still. I mean, we have to remember this as well. We depend on tax money in Germany, at least. It's not private theater. So so it's a question of the political justification rather than a real change of the form. Or to put it differently, I mean, the most interesting question is, what is the theater we want, or what theater can we make for a diverse society? I mean, we live in diverse societies, that's for sure. So how do we make theater that answers longings in this diverse society? And this means answers the longing of a young Muslim immigrant, and also answers the longing of a single mom who loves poems from Goethe as well. So it's a very, very hard thing to say we invite everyone all the time. So I found very interesting, if I understood correctly, what Julia said, although it's probably not pragmatic, but to say, okay, if you're interested in this kind of theater, you can go to this place. If you're interested in this kind of theater, you can go to this place. Then we would loosen a little bit the weight on all the theater makers to make everything for everyone all the time, and we would have less, maybe less provocations, less fights, less discourse, and more real experiences of things we don't know before. Because this is, from my point of view, the most exciting and fantastic thing about theater, to go inside and to experience something you don't know before, and to really have this experience. And I mean, I just hope that this could be a dream for the future, to have different theaters for different different identity questions, if we want to call it like this, and not only on stage but also in the canons, that the canons are in some sense undergoing a revolution, and we have different worldviews in different houses throughout the theater landscape.
Yes, I think this is very interesting in terms of how we navigate identities in spaces. And I was wondering, again, this is very married to each other, the conversation about representation, politics. I think to be apolitical in theatre is a massive privilege. And I also think that, I'm with Anne Bogart, one of my favorite theatre directors, on that everything in theatre is political, where you place a chair and who you put on stage is political. I sort of want to touch on something that I always relate to when thinking about political work is Erwin Piscator and his, you know, in political theater, he writes about the fact that, you know, that he was not naive enough to think that working in, you know, making in Nazi Germany, making theater was ever going to stop fascism. But what he was hoping for was the fact that there were his theater he was making would encompass critical responses, and that these critical responses would in fact stop fascism. So I'm just wondering about everything we talked about, the sort of, you know, upheaval that we live in, the dangerous time, the very aware time. What are our critical responses? And I'm going to go to Julia.
I think that's a super difficult question, because I wonder if we're even sensitive enough still to have critical responses. Because from what I feel at the moment, or what my experience is also from friends and colleagues, is that there's an overwhelmedness with the complexity of the issues and the seeming impossibility of resistance. Like this, it feels a bit like there's a lethargy, because we had just elections in Germany, and then the party who used to be in power is now not in power, but for a week or so they tried to form a coalition and a government. And it was an absurd situation, because it's never happened before in Germany, and it was clear they lost the election, but they didn't say they lost the election. And what happened was that a lot of my colleagues and friends said, but why did we vote for you if it's irrelevant, if it doesn't do anything and it doesn't influence our government anymore, if at the end of the day I gave my vote to someone else and then the government is still what the people didn't vote for. And this kind of resignation or frustration is something where I wonder, how can we, or what would the critical response even be? Would the critical response in times like these be to create spaces that show somehow positive utopias? Something like that, is that a critical response? Because I feel that at the moment everyone is so, it's hard to describe, everyone seems to be like wounded and hurt from everything, that I feel the biggest longing at the moment is a space where you can just be, tell your own story, be respected for that, raise your children in peace with whomever you want to raise them with, in whatever construction you want to raise them, and just be. And I wonder if that would be the most critical response that we can create, rather than trying for more violence. And at the same time, I feel that there's a lot of anger. And maybe that is also something where theatre could play a role in managing or translating anger into something constructive. Because I think anger is something very constructive.
Yes, I agree with you. Rage is a powerful tool, but I think there's also power. What you're getting at is there's power in softness. Softness is also part of revolutions, whether they're theatrical revolutions or political revolutions, or the one would argue that they're the same thing. Milo, what are your critical responses?
Yeah, I think the big mistake perhaps of all of the artists is to, you quoted Piscator, who thought that he could stop fascism with his plays, but perhaps he can change even inside fascism. I mean, the situation in the people in the theater, and save some people from fascism. Just to give you an example, I think the little changes, the little solidarities, and the little sustainabilities or changings of the system inside the system is what I at that moment interested in. And I'm hoping, and this is perhaps this old idea of the multitude, that in many places this happens, and capitalism, or however you would call this machine, this mega machine, would be changed from the inside. And of course you have discussions of care, and you have discussions of structural change. And I think one problem, of course, we have on the left, but we always had, is kind of the fight in between these two discussions about the aim and about the process you do to get to these aims. So is it possible to have a violent because you have to destroy structures somehow, and some people have to leave their positions. How can this violence be lead us to somewhere where we have less structural violence, you know? And I think this is the big problem of this very moment, this kind of transitions we are in, that we are living in the aim to have a less violent and a more caring space. We dismantle a lot of toxic energy, or a lot of discussions that are getting very, very aggressive and very high. And I think this is what especially of course in theater productions that you live daily. And I have the impression that it was more difficult like 2 or 3 years ago, and I have also the impression that everybody has to find her or his solutions, to find processes that are in itself, I'm thinking about processes, good. And then when you come in positions that you can change structures and say to people, okay, you don't have to produce a play, so there haven't to be a premiere day, or if the premiere day, if you are not finished, for example, we worked with one group, Monster Truck, then they worked with disabled people, they were not finished, and we said, okay, it will be later. Then it will be later, and perhaps it's not a play, perhaps it's something. That's an example. I mean, I do it myself, that I say, okay, perhaps we need 3 months, not 2 months. Perhaps it's some workshops or so open rehearsals, and there is no premiere. So we have to find ways of finding these spaces inside the structures, and then slowly these structures themselves, in my humble experience, slowly change. But you can't do sometimes you are confronted to people and to yourself that you say everything is perfect to be perfect now. Everybody have to feel super safe. There should be no trigger at all. There should be a kind of, I don't know, a meta message and pure beauty, but at the same time, it should be very political and we should really change. And then you say, but it's not possible to make all this, you know? So we have to be there, we have to be a bit patient and a bit with ourselves, but also with the others. So you had the idea of softness, and I think it's quite important.
Yes, I agree. And there's, there comes
with change and changing what Milo's talking about, same Julia, new ways that comes with a sense of destabilizing things. And when things get destabilized, people get scared. And I think it is about managing that fear and actually understanding that fear is not something to be afraid of, but rather embraced. Thank you for that, Milo. And over to Simone.
I would say that the most critical response the theater has to society is to underline its nature as a non-functional, non-profit organization in some sense, that it is not following the same logics as the markets or the political system. You don't vote for theater, and you don't use it as a startup or something. And so I would say this is the most the biggest challenge theater can still produce or be facing a functionalized society where everyone is using their apps to do everything, and everything is so easy, everything is instant, everything is there, and he or she is in power of consuming everything. Theater in some ways is a huge a rock in this sea of functionality and market logic. And I would say that as long as theater keeps this character, it will always be critical and always be political.
Thank you so much.
I am quite aware of the time, so I'd like to finish on an uplifting sort of note and just quickly go around the panelists and ask what gives you hope when it comes to theater. Julia.
Sitting in Pristina, speaking with all my incredible colleagues and realizing, it's not just us who's thinking the world is going crazy and trying to work against it, and having conversations like these, and then going home thinking the rest of the world is doing the exact same thing, so you're not crazy.
You're not alone.
Yeah, not alone.
Definitely not. Milo?
Exactly what she says. We could label it solidarity, no? Solidarity in collective failing, and then perhaps going together somewhere where we couldn't go alone. Because it's really when I don't know, I learned from Julia, perhaps somebody sees what we do, or we see plays, or so these kind of little solidarities, even in the rehearsal space, even in these kind of debates, is for me the only solution to this, because the fatality of failing is only fatal when you're alone, but when you are seen by others working together, it's really different.
I agree, I completely agree. And I'm going to go with solidarity as well, because I am Polish after all. And Simon?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of that theater is still a place of discourse, and that's beautiful, I would say, and that gives me hope.
Absolutely. And I would like to finish on a quote from one of my favorite writers, Black radical feminist Bell Hooks. Dominator culture has tried to keep us all afraid, to make us choose safety instead of risk, sameness instead of diversity, moving through that fear, finding out what connects us, reveling in our differences. This is the process that brings us closer. That gives us a world of shared values, meaningful community. Thank you so much, Milo, Julia Wissert, and Simon Strauss for joining us for this panel, and thank you to our audiences this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you.